Good evening, my name is Kelly Earhart, and I'm a storyteller for Haunted Williamsburg. During the day, I'm one of Colonial Williamsburg's research historians. If you're like everyone else in America right now, you've been spending a lot of time with your family. And you're beginning to learn as a parent whether you're strict or not. And if you're a child, you're learning which parent you can take advantage of at any given time. This story is about people just like you. In fact, it's about a strict father and his daughter, and what happens when you don't heed your parents. Mr. Throckmorton was one of the richest and most powerful businessmen in Virginia. He had one daughter, Eliza, whom he loved more than anything else. Only he and Eliza, well, it was the two of them in this world, as Mrs. Throckmorton had died some years ago. Mr. Throckmorton had a bad habit of spoiling Eliza. Beautiful clothing, beautiful jewelry, delicious food, down beds, everything and anything the girl may want, he provided it to her. Now, eventually she got to the age where it was time to find her a suitable marriage partner. And honestly, none of the men in Virginia were good enough. None of the men in British North America were good enough. So, Mr. Throckmorton sends his daughter to England to see if she can find a mate. And she is tremendously successful in catching the eye of others, particularly the aristocrats, the wealthy businessmen, and the merchants. Now, of course, she took no interest in them because she was 18 years old. And she did find love. His name was Joseph. And Joseph was a braggart, Joseph was a bully, Joseph was a liar, Joseph was mean. Joseph was the exact kind of guy you do not want around your 18-year-old daughter. She fell head over heels. The two of them even arranged to get married. And on the day that they were going to get married, Eliza received a letter. She opened the letter, she saw very quickly that it was from her father and that she must return immediately. I don't care how spoiled you are. And I don't care how much you think you're in love. If your very strict father says it's time to go home, it's time to go home. So she had all of her things packed and she was loaded into a carriage and had taken out towards the wharf. And as she's riding along, she's thinking about how sad she is that she'll never see Joseph again. The carriage stopped. She waited. And around the side and opening the door was Joseph. And Joseph said, and I quote, "My darling Eliza, I love you so. I will follow you to Virginia and we will be married." I know it sounds pretty dumb, right? Well, she was 18 and she loved this guy, so she thought it was the greatest thing she'd ever heard. In fact, it put a little secret smile on her face. And that little secret smile followed her all the way home to her father's house. And as a prudent and observant man, he noticed this little smile, and he assumed that she had fallen in love with an aristocrat or a merchant or a wealthy businessman. So he developed his own little smile, knowing that she was going to be well taken care of for the rest of her days. One afternoon, though, there was a knock at the door, and Mr. Throckmorton, who happened to be near it, opened the door. And on the other side of that door was Joseph. And immediately, Mr. Throckmorton knew. He knew there was no wealthy businessman, there was no aristocrat, and there was no merchant. It was this little pipsqueak. Mr. Throckmorton thought for a second. And they brought the young man in. They sat near the fire, and they began to talk. Well, Joseph talked. Joseph talked about how smart Joseph is. Joseph talked about how handsome Joseph is. Joseph talked about how much fun he is at a party. Joseph talked about how good he would do taking care of Eliza with Mr. Throckmorton's money. Yeah, that last one was a little too much. And very quickly, Mr. Throckmorton ordered Joseph out of the house. Of course, right as he was leaving and the door slammed behind him, in ran Eliza, crying and screaming, "You can't do such a thing." And her father looked at her and said, "There will be no wedding. That I can promise you." And of course, she fell into fits, crying and screaming. She runs up to her room and she pounds the walls and she stomps her little feet. And she stays up there all night, which is unusual. Usually Eliza, after a little while, comes back downstairs and apologizes. And then one night turned to 2. And then 2 to 3. The food that was going up for her meals was coming back untouched. She couldn't get out of bed. She got to the point where she was so weak, all she could do is lie there, and all that she could do was lie there. And Mr. Throckmorton would sit with her night after night after night, hoping, praying for any kind of sign that she was going to survive. One evening, as he was sitting there, she sat straight up in the bed. She looked him in the eye, screamed, "Father!" before she fell back down dead on the bed. Now, Mr. Throckmorton, of course, was overwhelmed with grief, but he was a man who needed things to do. That's how things get done. It doesn't matter how you feel. So he jumps up and he goes about the house giving orders to make mourning clothing and build a coffin and dress her in the most beautiful things she owns. Gowns, jewels, everything. The necklaces, the earrings, and the rings. Everything. Then the sad little funeral party made their way out to the graveyard, which is across the pasture. As they're walking, they realize just how cold and bitter and miserable this all is, and what a tragedy it was that she died. Mr. Throckmorton led the group, pushing almost as if he was trying to defeat the wind that was coming at him. They finally get to the site. 2 enslaved men had already opened the grave. He helped move her down. And that was it. He angrily took a fistful of dirt and threw it in the grave. He turned around, and as he left, so did the rest of the sad little party. 2 men who had been instructed to open the grave then closed it quickly and headed off, for it had begun to snow. Just a little. But it was a hint of what was to come. And at that point, Eliza Throckmorton was alone in her grave. She was alone in her grave, but she wasn't alone. Joseph was standing in the graveyard, just out of sight. But it wasn't just Joseph, it was also his cousin Tom. Now, Joseph would do just about anything to get what he wanted. Tom was ruthless and would stop at nothing. The 2 of them looked at each other, smiled, picked up their shovels, and headed over to the grave. They got to work very quickly. They thought they were awfully clever to wait just after had been back close. And they decided that this was going to be the most honest, easiest way to... They hit the coffin. While they threw apart their shadows, they both jumped into the hole, ripped open the coffin, and there she was in all of her finery. Necklaces, the earrings, the bracelets, and the rings. And they got right to work. And very quickly did they have those rings and necklaces and bracelets off. But now they needed to take off the rings, which they just would not come off. Joseph sat there struggling, pulling at her fingers, desperate to get them off. Meanwhile, Tom is watching him and he's smiling. And the reason he is smiling is because he has a very sharp instrument in his pocket that he knows he can use at any time to make the liberation of the rings a little easier. So he watched his cousin for a time, and Joseph struggled and struggled and struggled. And eventually, Tom became frustrated. So he took out that knife and he just swung. He somehow managed to miss his cousin, but Eliza wasn't so lucky. These fingers, gone. And then something strange happens. Her hand begins to bleed, pulsating in the grave and the snow that's beginning to fall. They only thought about that for a moment. Just a moment before Elizabeth sat up and screamed. That was enough for them. They hopped out of the hole and they were never seen again. Now at this point, she realizes she is alive. She's in a hole It is cold. She's missing part of her hand. She's going to get home. She finds a way to get herself up out of the grave and then uses her good hand and its nails to begin to crawl and pull herself. On a number of occasions, she tried, of course, to use her left hand as well, but that just ended in a splotch of blood in the snow. So she dragged herself across that pasture. She got up to the door. She was so weak and so tired and so relieved that she was here. She was only able to manage on the front door. They heard her. They did, except the snowstorm was growing, and they assumed it was just an animal. It wasn't until the next day that one of the enslaved women opened the door to find her frozen, covered in blood. She was brought back inside for her father to say goodbye to her one more time. Now, if you are a child with a strict parent and you don't listen to them, if you hear in the middle of the night on your door, Eliza Throckmorton coming to get you. Now, I know that sounds really stupid. I know, because we don't tell ghost stories that way anymore. In the 18th century, a lot of ghost stories had morals. And they wanted you to learn something. And in fact, their favorite time to tell ghost stories was at Christmas. Ever heard of A Christmas Carol? Now, that's written in the 1800s. But it's the same idea, that you're going to learn a moral from a ghost. As for being buried alive, it's very unlikely you'll be buried alive these days. But every once in a while, a body goes to a funeral home, and the mortician will begin his or her work, and they will puncture some part of the body, and it will bleed. And as we know, with Eliza, it's bleeding alive. So the likelihood of you being buried alive is low, but not impossible.